there's no question that President Trump has little use for the Europeans in general, and he has little use for the NATO alliance. And he has done enormous damage to transatlantic relations, and he has done significant damage to NATO itself. And if you think about it, he still has more than 2.5 years left in office. So he's going to be around for a long time. And there is no reason to think that his attitude towards NATO is going to change in any meaningful way. And in fact, what I think is going to happen is that he's going to continue to tear apart at the fabric of that institution. And he's going to continue to tear apart at the transatlantic relationship as well. So that's point number one. Point number two is, you want to understand that we have long been interested in pivoting to Asia. And when you pivot to a place, you have to pivot away from another place. And the place that we're going to pivot away from is Europe, because we're not going to pivot away from the Middle East because of Israel. Given the fact that we're joined at the hip with Israel and that the lobby is so incredibly powerful in the United States, we're not going to leave the Middle East in any meaningful way. And we're certainly going to remain tied to Israel. And at the same time, as I said, we're bent on containing China and East Asia. So we're going to have to prioritize. And when we prioritize, number 3 on our list will be Europe. And that means that we will greatly reduce our footprint, our military footprint in Europe. And that means our conventional forces. And given Trump's druthers, he may actually pull us completely out of Europe. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think it's a possibility. And if you talk to the Europeans today, the Europeans fully understand what's going on here. They understand that Trump is shifting the burden of providing security in Europe off the shoulders of the United States onto the shoulders of the Europeans. So the Europeans are beginning to do more for themselves. They're beginning to think of the EU as their principal security environment rather than, their principal security institution rather than the EU. So I think that what you see is a NATO that has been greatly weakened because of President Trump's attitude towards Europe and towards the alliance, and also because of those structural forces. And I wouldn't be surprised if the alliance existed in name only when Trump finally leaves office in January 2029.
Yeah, that's. I'd love to do a whole show with you on that, because that's a fascinating topic. May even add in the changes that the two wars, the Russia-Ukraine war and the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, are changing so many different things. I think the United Nations is also becoming more and more just an empty suit and just a blah, blah, blah forum to talk, but no actual action, not like it was originally created. I'd love to talk to you about those kind of things. But I want to speak on the current topic here. In terms of the Russia-Ukraine war, there has been an escalation, first of all, of rhetoric on the Russian side about how they're going to start hitting command and control centers and decision-making centers in Kiev. And then they hit some targets, but it didn't really go much further than that. And then afterwards, it seemed like Zelensky kind of got a little bit of encouragement by the fact that there wasn't a big, huge strike that wiped out a bunch of stuff in Kiev. And he sent this pretty strong letter to publicly send to Putin saying, I want to have a negotiation. I want to have a talk. And all this long letter stuff basically asks, I'd like you to surrender to me and do whatever I want to do. It was ridiculous, and it was in the open, et cetera. And so that stirred up a lot of conversation since that time on both sides of Ukraine and Russia. In a conference with the European leaders, Zelensky was asked, I think it was just yesterday, about what he intended with that letter.
During 1 month, I sent several letters with different goals to different institutions, beginning from EU, United States, White House and Congress, and also Putin. I had different goals. For example, the United States, I really wanted to do everything to shift a little bit from Middle East to Ukraine, the situation. and I need it very much. I can't share with you all the details, but believe me, my nation needed too much anti-ballistic missiles. So, and I got the result. And I will not share with you details of this result, but I did it. And I think I had, no, I think I know, I had a goal, sending a letter to Putin, for example. And I think I've got the result what I needed.
So he didn't really go into the details of what he thought that result was, but what do you make of this? Because it sounds like that he himself is saying, I was just trying to manipulate everybody in Europe and the United States so I can get some more anti-aircraft missiles, which he says I got, and I had a purpose with Putin. What do you make of those two claims?
I don't think he got hardly anything from the United States. He wanted patriots, right? And we don't have patriots to give him. The idea that he has a rosy future in terms of getting armaments from the Europeans and from us is delusional, right? The United States is not in a position to give him lots of weaponry. We've used our precious weaponry already in large numbers in the Middle East war. And by the way, if we go up the escalation ladder in the Ukraine war, as now appears to be the case, we're going to use up more of that precious weaponry. And then we have the whole question of, can we afford to even do that, given that we need weaponry in East Asia to contain China? There's no weaponry to give him. So he faces a very dark future with the United States. And there was this Czech-led alliance that was supplying him or supplying Ukraine with lots of heavy caliber artillery munition and other munitions. And a good number of the countries, the European countries that were in that coalition, that Czech-led coalition, have pulled out and told Zelensky that they're not going to give Ukraine any more assistance through that alliance. So European support's beginning to soften. American support has basically dried up. I'm talking about support in terms of sending material or weapons to Ukraine. And with regard to Putin, what's the purpose of sending an antagonistic letter to Putin and treating him like he's a kindergarten child? It just doesn't make any sense at all. But that's the way Zelensky operates. And as you and I have said on countless occasions, this one's going to be settled on the battlefield, and it is being settled on the battlefield. There's not going to be a diplomatic solution until Ukraine is at a point where it has no choice but to throw up its hands and ask for an armistice.
And in fact, speaking of those, we showed a couple of days ago Putin's response to that himself on camera, which he looked at it and viewed it with contempt, if not a little bit of anger, about saying how, this rude thing, it's not going to make us do anything. And then Lavrov actually came out also and said, yeah, just what you said, this will be settled in the military form, and that's just how it's going to be, because apparently nobody wants to talk with us. The Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Nebenzia, said this.
Zelensky himself prevented himself at a certain point from talking to President, issuing a decree forbidding him to engage with President Putin. All right, if you want to talk, we never refused. But he made it through a so-called megaphone diplomacy. He made it public. The letter was boorish. If you want to talk, even if you forbade yourself to talk, you do it discreetly through the back channels so that it can be arranged in a proper way. But the way he addressed, of course, prevents us from engaging in talks on the conditions that he puts on the table.
So, I mean, if you were actually engaged and interested in negotiations, then that's exactly how you would do it, which then, of course, implies that this may be something, and this is what I'd like you to address here, is Zelensky's actions here something akin to what we're trying to do in the Iran war with some of these Kellogg and Jack Keane comments, to where he's just trying to double down. Anything besides having a negotiation. So I'm going to have this public thing that's going to make me look tough by putting it in Putin's face, and then allegedly going to get something over here, but just trying to buy a little bit of time, ignoring what the realities that you just described would be. What do you make of that?
I was thinking about it just like you were. As I was listening to him talk, I was thinking, here's another delusional individual talking about how to deal with a war that's gone south. And you just kind of shake your head and wonder. I mean, if you look at the position the Ukrainians are in, you look at the situation on the battlefield, they are badly outnumbered in terms of the number of troops the Russians have versus the number of troops they have. I'd bet it's over 2-to-1 advantage in Russia's favor. Furthermore, all the evidence is they don't have enough troops, the Ukrainians, to thickly populate the forward edge of the battle area, and they're gaping holes. Now, they're somewhat able to deal with that with drones. There's no question about that, and that slows the Russians down. But if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the Russians are moving forward. Slowly for sure, but they are moving forward. And the Ukrainian army is showing all signs, all sorts of signs that it's in deep trouble. All you have to do is look at the number of people who are AWOL, the number of draft dodgers, and so forth and so on. This is an army that is in real trouble, and they don't have missile defenses of any sort anymore. That's why Zelensky's trying to get Patriot missiles from Trump, but he can't get them. So they're in deep trouble. And Zelensky talks like he's in the driver's seat. You know, we hear all this rhetoric in the West that Ukraine has turned the tide on the battlefield. They've got the Russians on their back feet, and the Russians are suffering enormous casualties. Putin is not popular anymore. All sorts of people want to get rid of him. The drone campaign with the strikes deep into Mother Russia is having a deadly effect. All we have to do is just push a little bit harder now, and Putin will submit. This is the rhetoric that you hear in the West. I mean, I read some of these articles that people write, and these are prominent people describing what's happening in Ukraine. And I just sort of scratch my head and say, for anybody who's following what's going on in the war, you can make a case that the Russians are not winning quickly. The drones have helped the Ukrainians slow down the Russian steamroller. Fine, you can make that argument. But to argue that the Ukrainians have turned the tide, that they're going to win the war in any meaningful way, I don't know how you can make that argument based on what's happening on the actual battlefield.
And yeah, well, you partially answered the question I was going to ask anyway, but I'll ask the rest of it too. Is that how do you respond to those people who say, well, it's not just that Russia's going slow; they don't have the wherewithal. They can't win this overall because it's already been 4.5 years. There's a lot of grumbling going on in Russia right now. A lot of people are getting aggravated at Putin because he hasn't won, and so then they maybe, if as long as they drag it out on the front, they can expand that internal anger, and then eventually, like the public opinion caused us to withdraw from Vietnam, eventually that will cause Putin to have to say, all right, fine, I'll have a negotiated settlement on the line of contact, which apparently Zelensky has been pushing for of late. He finally has said, okay, well, I tell you what, I won't give you all 4 of the oblasts, but wherever the line of contact is, and we'll freeze it there and call it a day and whatever. What do you say to that argument?
Well, just a couple of points. First of all, it's very important to understand that the Russians don't draft people and send them to Ukraine, right? It's an all-volunteer military that's doing the fighting in Ukraine. And to go back to the Vietnam War, I mean, one of the reasons the Vietnam War was so controversial and eventually came to an end was because we had a draft. And when you have a draft and you have to send people to the front, it's a wholly different situation compared to having an all-volunteer military. And, you know, we were talking before about the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians draft people, and many of those people don't want to be dragooned into the military. They go AWOL. This is why they have a huge AWOL problem. And they also have a draft dodger problem. The Russians don't have that. So even if there is dissatisfaction inside of Mother Russia, the fact is that given that you're fighting with an all-volunteer military, you can get away with a lot. Furthermore, it's very important to understand that one of the reasons that the Russians have moved slowly, it's not just simply the drones. It's the fact that the Russians have not been willing to pursue a tactical strategy, or let me put it differently. They've not been willing to adopt tactics that involve frontal attacks against fixed fortifications where the attacking forces get mowed down, right? Sometimes people will describe the Russians as sort of engaging in frontal wave attacks. They just
meat grinder attacks, they used to call it.
What was that?
Meat grinder attacks.
Yeah, meat grinder attacks. Exactly, Danny. They're not doing that. They're moving very slow and very purposefully, and they're trying to minimize the casualties. They're fully aware of how deadly it is up on the front lines, as are the Ukrainians, for that matter, right? You get up on the front lines in a place like Ukraine, and it doesn't take you more than a few seconds to figure out that surviving is not easy, and you better come up with tactics that maximize the chances that you'll survive. And the Russians, of course, have done that. But that involves moving actually quite cautiously and not, being very blitzkrieg oriented or anything like that. The Russians are not audacious at a tactical or even at a strategic level. And that means that the casualties are not that high. And I think you're going to move more slowly in terms of conquering territory than they have moved. But nevertheless, you're going to keep the casualties down, which is true. And again, you have an all-volunteer military, and they're rolling up the territory in the 4 oblasts that they claim they want. They control all of what's the territory? What's the?
I think it's Luhansk, and then I think most of Donetsk, if I'm not mistaken.
They control all of Luhansk, right?
Yeah. And
they control about 75% of Donetsk. They control about 75% of Zaporozhye, and they control about 75% of Kherson. And I believe they'll eventually end up controlling 100% of those 4 oblasts, plus Crimea, of course. And I wouldn't be surprised, Danny, as we've talked about before, if they end up going after Odessa and Kharkiv as well. Very hard to say whether that'll happen because, drones make it difficult to just capture large swaths of territory all of a sudden. But nevertheless, they may end up capturing those 2 oblasts as well. But they're going to win the war. It's going to be an ugly victory. But the idea that Ukraine is going to, turn the tide and is turning the tide, I think is belied by the facts.
Yeah, and I know we're about out of time here, so just briefly, is there any scenario that you can come up with in your mind where Ukraine could turn the tide? Is there any amount of weapons that we could give? Is there any tactics they could choose? Is there any way to drag this out long enough to actually cause something to happen inside of Russia? Is there any scenario you can imagine that could literally physically turn the tide to where Ukraine would eventually regain lost territory?
Danny, just real quick before John answers, I just wanted to show you that Trump is now canceling tonight the new strikes on Iran.
Well, there you go. No more robber barons.
I think, Danny, to your credit, he's listening to your show. and what happened here is he heard that you and I were patriotic Americans who were interested in seeing him do the right thing, as is the case with Trita Parsi. In fact, he would be very well suited to call up Trita Parsi. If President Trump talked to Trita Parsi on a daily basis, he'd be in much better shape today than he is, given that he's talking to the generals that we mentioned and Lindsey Graham and assorted other people who don't understand Strategy 101, which, as you and I have talked about, is shocking, but nevertheless seems to be true. But
okay. Let's see what he says there. Based on the fact that discussions with the Islamic Republic of Iran have been brought to the highest level, the discussions have been brought to the highest level, and approved. I have the United States of America cancel the scheduled strikes and bombings against Iran this evening. Discussions and final points have been, in both concept and great detail, approved by all parties, including U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia, and a bunch of other countries. The naval blockade will remain in full force, and in fact, until this transaction is finalized, time and place is announced shortly. Now, that's almost identical to something he published about 10 or 12 days ago. So I literally put no stock in that whatsoever. But I don't know. I guess we'll see. As long as it stopped the bombing tonight, maybe there is something else going on behind the scenes. What do you think?
Feels like we're at Coney Island on the roller coaster.
Right.
You just never know. But I want to just say this, Danny. I think that we never want to lose sight of the fact that what is really the most important element of this story is the international economy. And all you have to do is look at what's happening with inflation, interest rates, price of gas, so forth and so on. And the incentives for President Trump to shut this one down quickly are just enormous. They're just enormous. He would really be crazy to go up the escalation ladder, especially to try and take Kyrgyz Island and control Iranian oil. Oh, it would just be such a foolish mistake. And so I think that he at some point just has to back off from the military approach to dealing with this problem and move to get some sort of ceasefire, and then move to gain trust with the Iranians as best he can, and then work out some sort of deal if that's possible. I'm not sure that's possible, by the way, given how little trust there is and given what a terrible deal maker he is. But I hope
we had Robert Barnes on the show yesterday, and he said we need to retitle this. It's now Art of the No Deal for President Trump compared to what it used to be. So I think that's a pretty apt description.
Yeah. But anyway, I think that I bet that, somebody told him the basic facts of life here, which is think about the economy, President Trump, and that will focus the mind, and you will quickly understand we've got to shut this one down. We've got to get a ceasefire. And by the way, Danny, if we get the ceasefire, going back to our discussion of what the ceasefire looks like, we get the ceasefire, the strait is opened, and Iranian oil comes flowing out, right? And we then go a long way towards moving towards fixing this problem, the economic problem. We're still going to pay a real price here.
Yep.
We can damage limit if we get a ceasefire tomorrow. And again, that means getting that Iranian oil out into global markets. And I hope viewers remember that in the early part of this war, during the bombing, Iranian oil was flowing out of the Gulf because President Trump understood quite correctly he needed that Iranian oil in global markets. And of course, he still does. But if you could really open the strait in a meaningful way and not straight, shut down Bab el-Mandab Strait, out of the Red Sea, keep that one open too, you go a long way towards stemming
getting the damage.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Man, this is truly a roller coaster day. Who knows what it may be by the time the evening comes around? It could be back to bombing for all we know. But that's where it is today. And as always, we're very, very grateful for you coming in to explain all of these crazy things. And as a reminder, there's Mearsheimer.substack.com to where you can keep up with John all the time. And he always posts a lot of great stuff. Look, there's sometimes even from the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, go to see there. But look forward to seeing you, John, on the next episode.
Thank you, Danny. Look forward to seeing you as well.
And we'll see you guys. I am back on some travels, and we've got a pretty busy travel schedule here the next month or so. I'm in and out, so you'll see me with some different backdrops here the next time, I think. But there's so many things going on. We definitely can't stop bringing you stories, so we will do that even while on vacation. Thanks very much, folks, and I'll see you next time on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We don't have sponsors because we hate to hit you over the head with ads. I don't like them. So show a little love back. Subscribe, like, and send this to somebody you care about.